The IMCONJUGATE function in Excel allows us to calculate the complex conjugate of a complex number. The function itself is quite straightforward. We type =, IMCONJUGATE, and we supply to it a complex number. Now do keep in mind that within Excel, a complex number is considered as text or string. Okay, so let's pull this down, and as you can see, the complex conjugate is nothing but taking the real part of your complex number and then flipping the sign in front of the imaginary part of your complex number. So 2 plus 2i becomes 2 minus 2i. Now, this complex conjugate has some interesting properties. So for example, if we add the complex conjugate with its complex number, we will be getting 2 times the real part of the complex number. Okay, so now in order to add 2 complex numbers together, we cannot simply write a plus sign like this. This will return a value error because we are adding 2 strings together, right? So we need a special function, which is the IMSUM function, which allows us to add 2 complex numbers together. So I supply the 2 numbers and close the parentheses. And if I now pull this downwards, you can see that each time we are getting double the real part of the complex number that we started with. As you can see here, we had 2 as a real part and we end up with 4. Here we had 1 as a real part, we end up with 2. Same here. Here we have no real part and we end up with a 0. Now, another interesting property of the complex conjugate is that if we multiply the complex conjugate with its complex number, then we will be getting the real part squared plus the imaginary part squared as well. So let's demonstrate this. If we want to multiply 2 complex numbers together, we use the IMPRODUCT function, which allows us to multiply 2 or more complex numbers. Once again, we could not simply do this with an asterisk like we would normally do if we multiply numbers in Excel, because we're actually working with text here. So I supply the 2 complex numbers as 2 separate arguments. I press enter and I pull this downwards. Okay, and so now let's prove that this is indeed the square of the real part plus the square of the imaginary part. Okay, so we can extract the real part of a complex number using the IMReal function. I supply the complex number and then I square this. To this, I will be adding the square of the imaginary part. For this, I can use the imaginary function, which will return the imaginary coefficient of a complex number. So I supply to it the complex number and I will also square this. Now notice that I did not need to use the IMSUM function to add these 2 numbers together, because both the IMReal and the imaginary function will return real numbers, being the coefficients. So I press enter and there indeed we have the result. And as you can see, this matches up exactly. The complex conjugate can also be really useful whenever you need to divide 2 complex numbers. Of course, in Excel, we can use the IMDiv function for this, but when you have to do this by hand, usually we multiply the division by the complex conjugate divided by the complex conjugate, and that will get rid of the imaginary part in our denominator. Now, whenever you want to calculate the complex conjugate, you can use the IMCONJUGATE function and supply it with a complex number, and out will come the complex conjugate. Thanks for subscribing and leaving an optional tip. Consider watching this video next.